Montana Territory, October 1872. The wind blew sharp off the Bitterroots that night, cold enough to crack skin and make horses skittish. Zachary Cole pulled his coat tighter as he stepped down from his mare, boots crunching over frost-laced dirt just outside the half-dead town of Clearwater Hollow. He had not planned to stop, but the horse needed rest, and something in his gut had turned him off the trail. He caught sight of her near the crumbled steps of what used to be a schoolhouse. She was curled beneath the overhang, wrapped in layers of old newspaper, the ink smudged and flaking across her cheek like ash. For a second, he thought she was dead. Then her fingers twitched. Zachary dropped beside her without thinking. "Miss," he said, steady but low. "You awake?" The girl stirred, eyes fluttering open. Her lips were cracked, her face hollow. "Go away," she rasped. "You're freezing," he said. "Let me help." I said no. But her hands kept shaking. She looked maybe 20, maybe younger, but her eyes had seen too much. Zachary stood, crossed back to his saddlebag, and pulled out the wool blanket he kept rolled behind his saddle. He came back and unfolded it over her shoulders without asking. She flinched, but did not push it off. Her voice was small. "Why?" He crouched again, met her eyes. "Because nobody deserves to die like this." She blinked fast, then tucked the blanket tighter around herself, silent. Her face was streaked with dirt, but there was something proud in the way she sat up straighter under the warmth. "My name's Zachary Cole. I'm headed south, but I can stay through the night. Keep the fire going." She did not answer, but when he turned to start gathering wood, she whispered, "Harriet." He looked back. "Harriet what?" "Harriet Langley." Zachary nodded once. "All right, Harriet Langley. Let's get you warm." By morning, the frost had melted into mud. Harriet sat near the fire, the blanket still around her, watching him boil coffee in a dented tin pot. Her hair was tangled, her clothes threadbare, but her back was straight and her eyes steady. "You should go," she said as he handed her a tin cup. He sat across from her. "You from Clearwater Hollow?" She shook her head. "We came from Missouri. My father, mother, my 2 younger brothers claimed land up near the ridge, past the cottonwoods." Zachary waited. "They died the first winter. Fever, the pneumonia. I stayed. Tried to keep the place going." Her fingers tightened around the cup. "But the roof gave in last spring. Rain took the rest." "You have no one left?" "No," she stared into the fire. "I tried to make it work." "I really did." Zachary nodded. "I believe you." Harriet looked at him then. Really looked. "Why are you out here?" He hesitated. "Spent most of my life drifting. Helped build the Kansas and Pacific line. Fought off rustlers in Dakota. Been looking for something that sticks." Her voice was quiet. "You found it yet?" He smiled, but it was tired. "Not yet." They sat in silence for a while. The fire crackled. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk cried. "I can work," Harriet said suddenly. "If you're traveling south, I can earn my keep. I'm not weak." "I never said you were." She met his gaze. "I will not be a burden." Zachary studied her, the way she held herself, hurt but still standing. "All right," he said. "But we start with breakfast." They rode out by noon, Zachary atop his mare, Harriet on the pack mule he had bought last spring in Helena. She held the reins steady, her posture stiff but determined. The blanket stayed wrapped around her shoulders. By the second evening, they found shelter in an abandoned trapper's cabin near the river. Zachary built the fire while Harriet sorted through what little food they had. Beans, dried meat, and a single apple she had saved from his supply. "You ever trap?" he asked her as he cleaned out the old iron pot. She shook her head. "I learned to snare rabbits. My father taught me that much." "Good. We will need that." That night, after they ate, Harriet leaned against the wall of the cabin, her knees drawn up. "You could have left me," she said. "I know, but you did not." He looked over. "You remind me of someone I lost." Harriet turned toward him. "Who?" "My sister. She died in Kansas. Fever." She was quiet a long moment. "I am sorry." "Thank you." Outside, the wind howled low through the trees. Inside, the fire warmed the space between them. Harriet's voice was soft. "I did not think I would ever be warm again." Zachary looked at her, and something in his chest shifted. "You will be." By the 10th day, they had crossed into Idaho territory. The land opened wide and golden, late autumn leaves burning red along the Snake River. Harriet's cheeks had begun to pink again, her eyes less hollow. She laughed once when Zachary's mare stepped in a puddle and splashed his boots. He had not heard her laugh before. They stopped by the river to rest. Harriet knelt to fill the canteen, and Zachary watched her from the bank. She moved easier now, looser. Like she remembered she had a body and it could still work. I should tell you, she said, not looking at him. I was engaged once. Before we left Missouri. Zachary sat down on a rock. What happened? He stayed. I went. She glanced over. He said my father was foolish. That I was foolish to follow. Were you? She stood, twisting the cap onto the canteen. No, he nodded. Good. They rode on. That night, under the stars, Harriet sat beside the fire, brushing her fingers over the edge of the blanket he had given her. It was worn but warm, patched in places with pieces of old shirts. This blanket, she said, you have had it a long time. Since Texas, Zachary said. It has seen a lot. She looked up. You gave it to me like it was nothing. It was not nothing. Harriet smiled faintly, then looked down at her hands. I did not think I would feel safe again. Zachary reached across the space between them. Not a grand gesture, just his fingers brushing hers. You are safe now, he said. Her eyes lifted to meet his, and in that moment, something settled between them. Not loud, just certain. You mean to keep going? She asked. I do. She nodded slowly. Then I will go with you. Zachary's hand closed around hers, firm and warm. All right, he said. We go together. They came into Salmon Crossing under a gray sky, the air damp with the threat of snow. The town leaned more toward the practical than the pretty low buildings of rough-cut pine, smoke rising from squat chimneys, mud in the street thick enough to pull at hooves. Zachary led them toward the livery first, his mare favoring her right leg after the last stretch over shale. Harriet stayed beside the mule, her posture still straight, though her shoulders dipped with each step. She hadn't spoken since the ridge north of the canyon, not since they'd passed a burial marker half swallowed by weeds and she'd gone quiet, mouth pressed thin. You all right to wait while I see to the horses? Zachary asked. She nodded once. I'll walk them. She's limping. I'll handle it. Harriet gave the mule's reins a tug and stepped back. I'll look for water then. He watched her go, the edge of her skirt already collecting mud. Inside the livery, the old man tending the stalls was missing 2 fingers and most of his left ear. He didn't ask Zachary's name, just grunted and pointed toward an empty stall. Lodging, Zachary asked. Try the widow at the end of Baker Street. Blue shutters. She don't like noise. Zachary paid him in coin, then slipped the saddle off the mare and rubbed her down with slow, practiced strokes. When he stepped outside again, Harriet was crouched near a shallow trough, rinsing her palms. Her sleeves were rolled to her elbows, and her skin was raw from the cold water, but her face had loosened a little, her jaw no longer clenched. Found a place to sleep, Zachary said. Not much, but it's dry. Do they take women? Didn't ask, but we'll sort it. She dried her hands on the edge of her skirt and stood. They walked the length of Baker Street together. At the far end, a sagging house with peeling blue shutters leaned slightly to one side. A thin woman with a braid like steel wool stood on the porch, arms crossed. She looked them over without blinking. Need a room, Zachary said. 1 bed, the woman replied. Harriet lifted her chin. That'll do. The woman studied her for a moment longer, then stepped aside. Inside, the air smelled of cedar and starch. Their room sat at the back, narrow but clean, with a stove in the corner and a window that looked out on a fence line strung with rusting wire. Harriet moved to the window and laid her fingertips against the glass. Zachary set his pack down and turned to her. You want to stay here a few days? She didn't answer. Instead, she unpinned her hair. The strands fell unevenly, some cut short, others tangled. I need work, she said. A dressmaker, maybe. Or laundress. I've done both. There's a feed store down the lane. Might know of something. She nodded, still not looking at him. I'll go ask. He crossed the room and placed a hand on the edge of the stove, checking the heat. Harriet. She turned. You don't have to fix everything in one day. I know. Her voice was even. But I need to be more than your burden. He didn't try to argue. Instead, he opened his pack, pulled out the battered tin cup, and set it on the stove. There's coffee left. She blinked, then gave a faint nod. All right. That evening, they sat on the porch of the widow's house, watching a boy across the road herd 2 goats into a lean-to. Harriet held the cup between her palms, not drinking, just letting the warmth sink in. Did you ever think, she said quietly, you'd settle somewhere? Zachary leaned back against the porch post. Sometimes. What stopped you? Didn't find the right reason. She was quiet a long while. Then, I thought if I could make the land work, it'd make me worth keeping. He turned his head to look at her. I steady. You're worth keeping without proving anything. Harriet didn't answer, but she didn't look away either. Supper was stew thin but hot and bread that crumbled at the touch. They ate at the table in the widow's kitchen, neither speaking much. Afterward, Harriet offered to wash the dishes. The widow handed her a cloth without a word. Zachary waited outside, watching the lantern light through the kitchen window. He could see Harriet's profile, her hands moving over tin plates, her features quiet but not distant. Something about the way she stood now was different than before. Not harder, just returned. When she stepped back into the room they shared, her apron was damp, her sleeves rolled again. She closed the door behind her and leaned against it. I asked about work, she said. The clerk at the store said there's a woman who takes in mending out by the mill. I'll walk there in the morning. He nodded. I'll need to shoe the mare. Might take a while. She crossed the room, unbuttoning her cuffs. We'll meet back here? I'll be here. She hesitated, then sat on the edge of the bed. I don't know what this is, Zachary. What we're doing. He moved to the stove and fed in another log. You want to stop? No, her voice was a whisper. I just want to know it's real. He turned, slow and sure, and crossed to stand in front of her. He didn't touch her, just looked down into her face until her breath caught. It's real, he said. As much as anything I've known. She reached up then, fingers brushing his sleeve, anchoring herself. All right, she said. Then I'll stay. By the third morning in Salmon Crossing, the first snow fell thin flakes that melted the moment they touched earth, but lingered on rooftops and fence posts like breath held too long. Zachary rose before light, leaving Harriet still curled beneath the quilt, her breath soft, lashes resting against her cheek. Outside, the town was hushed, the sharp edges of its usual clatter softened by the cold. He made his way to the smithy near the edge of the creek, where a black-bearded man named Trask let him use a corner of the forge in exchange for cleaning out the ash pit. The mare's shoe was split at the bend, likely from shale near the pass, and Zachary took his time replacing it. As he worked, the ache in his hand's old brakes, never set right, burned more than usual, but he bore it without pause. By mid-morning, Harriet had gone to the mill house east of town, where a widow named Mrs. Haverland paid $2 a week for steady needlework. The path was rough, rutted by wagons hauling pine, but she walked it with her chin lifted, scarf snug beneath her chin. She passed a boy stacking dried corn husks against a fence. He glanced at her shoes mended in 3 places and offered her a half-smile. She didn't return it. Inside the mill house, the air was thick with dust and the scent of old wool. Mrs. Haverland handed her a basket of torn work shirts and pointed toward a bench near the stove. You prefer to stitch by hand or take the treadle? I can do both. The woman narrowed one eye. You've got the fingers for it, I'll say that. Harriet didn't reply. She took her seat, pulled a thimble from her coat pocket, and threaded her needle with steady hands. That evening, Zachary returned with a small bundle from the general store, a bar of lye soap, a tin of lard, and a square of muslin he'd bartered for with the last of the smoked venison. When he stepped into the room, Harriet was sitting cross-legged on the floor, her skirt hem pinned back, patching a tear near the knee. You're early, she said without looking up. They had fewer horses than I expected. He crouched beside her, set down the bundle. Thought you might want this. She inspected each item in silence, then ran her fingers over the muslin. Doesn't smell like anything. Better that way. She folded the cloth and set it aside. Mrs. Haverland works her girls hard, but she doesn't cheat them. I'll bring back coin next week. No need. I want to. That night, as the snow gathered in the corners of the window pane, Harriet stood by the stove brushing out her hair with fingers alone. Zachary sat on the bed, watching the firelight catch in the strands. You ever think about planting roots? She asked. He rested his elbows on his knees. Once, down near Abilene. Thought about opening a smith shop. What stopped you? He rubbed his jaw. The man who owned the land turned out to be crooked. Sold it twice. I left before it got worse. She nodded. You think you'd try again? Maybe. With the right land. He paused. With the right person. She turned then, folding her arms. Her voice was quiet. You think I'd do well on a piece of land? I think you already did, with worse odds. Harriet moved toward the bed, sat beside him. Her shoulder brushed his arm, and they stayed like that, the fire popping soft behind them. I'm tired of running, she said. He looked at her, waited. I want something that won't fall through my hands. He reached up, touched a strand of hair that had fallen across her cheek, tucking it behind her ear. So do I. She leaned into him then, not all at once, but slow, like easing onto ice she wasn't sure would hold. He wrapped an arm around her, and she let her head rest there, against his collarbone. Neither of them said anything more. They didn't need to. The next morning, the snow had stuck. Thin lines of white clung to fences and rooftops. Harriet woke with her hand resting against Zachary's chest, his arm around her waist. She didn't move. Outside, the town stirred to life again, but inside the small room with blue shutters, it was quiet and warm and theirs. The cold settled deeper in the coming days, not harsh yet, but enough to turn the dirt roads brittle and send smoke curling earlier from every chimney in Salmon Crossing. Harriet began walking to the mill house before dawn, her mended boots wrapped in burlap to keep the wet from seeping through. She worked in the corner by the window, her stitches straight and quick, her eyes sharp on every seam. She never spoke unless spoken to, but the other women began to nod when she passed, and Mrs. Haverland set aside a proper spool of thread just for her. Zachary found a rhythm of his own. He took up work at the smithy, easing the burden from Trask's crooked hands in exchange for a cot and a share of the forge's earnings. His shoulders ached more now, but it wasn't the same kind of ache as before. This one came with purpose. At night, he returned to the room with the blue shutters, where Harriet would be bent over her basket or waiting by the stove with a quiet meal. One evening, Harriet pulled a bundle from beneath the bed and laid it out across the quilt, an old shirt of Zachary's, worn smooth at the cuffs, now with new buttons and the seam restitched where it had frayed. I found it in the wash bin, she said, not looking up from her hands. Figured it could still serve. He stepped closer, smoothing a hand down the fabric. Didn't think it was worth saving. I did. He sat beside her, not speaking for a long stretch. The lamplight made the fabric glow faintly, like something treasured. Harriet rested her needle and folded the shirt again. I've been thinking, she said finally. If we stay through winter, I could ask after teaching. There's children enough, and no proper schoolhouse since the fire last year. I've done it before. Just letters and sums, but it's something. He leaned back on his palms, watching her face. You want to stay? I think I might. Zachary nodded once. Then we will. A week later, he found a cabin for sale half-finished, pine walls already upright, a hearth built but not yet used. It sat near the edge of a field that had gone fallow but could be turned again come spring. The man who'd started it had taken his sick wife east to St. Louis and left the deed with the minister. Zachary paid for it with the last of his trail savings and a promise to shoe the minister's team twice before spring. That night, Harriet stood in the doorway of the skeleton house, the wind tugging at her skirt, her breath misting in the cold. It needs a roof, she said, voice soft. And a door, Zachary added. But the bones are strong. She stepped inside, ran her fingers along the windowsill. It's quiet. It could be ours. She turned to him. You're certain? I'm sure. They spent the next days gathering what they could scrap boards from behind the mill. A rusted stove Trask was willing to part with, old wool from the widow's attic. Harriet bartered her stitching for glass panes, and Zachary worked from dawn to dusk laying shingles with hands that cracked and bled by the end of each day. At night, they returned to the blue-shuttered room, where she rubbed lard into his palms and he rested his head against her shoulder without words. One morning, before the sun had cleared the ridge, Harriet brought him a wrapped bundle tied with twine. Found it at the market, she said. Paid with my own coin. He unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a small ledger, its cover plain, its pages clean. For the house records, she said, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear. What we plant, what we lose, what we save. Zachary turned the book over in his hands, then looked at her. You think we'll have enough to plant? Her voice didn't waver. We will. He set the ledger down and touched her wrist. Then let's start writing. That winter, snow came early and stayed. The wind howled down from the north, sharp and constant. But inside their cabin patched, crooked, and still missing half the trim, the stove burned steady, and the walls held firm. Harriet spent her evenings piecing together a quilt from scraps of muslin and old feed sacks. Zachary carved shells from pine, his knife stroke slow but sure. One night, Harriet set aside her needle and crossed the room. She rested her palm against his chest, just above the place where his heartbeat thudded slow and even. I never thought I'd have this, she said, not as confession but as fact. You have it now. She nodded, eyes steady on his. and I'll keep it. He kissed her then. Not rushed, not uncertain. Just a quiet sealing of everything already known. Outside, the snow kept falling, but inside, the world had gone warm. By early March, the thaw had begun in fit sunlight pooling in the ruts of the road, snow melting off the eaves in slow, steady drips. The wind still carried a bite, but the scent of loam was beginning to rise from the earth, and the crows had returned to the fence posts, calling sharp into the morning. Zachary hammered in the last hinge of the barn door just after dawn, the wood creaking as it swung open for the first time without resistance. Harriet stood a few paces behind him, sleeves rolled, her hands still dusted with sawdust from sanding the ladder rungs the day before. She didn't speak, just reached out and tested the swing herself. Zachary leaned against the frame, brushing a splinter from his palm. You think it'll hold? Harriet met his eyes. We built it. Of course it will. They spent that afternoon hauling stones from the riverbank to line the garden bed. Harriet worked in silence, focused, her back straight against the wind. Zachary watched her from where he knelt, planting the first rows of onion sets they traded for in town. She moved differently now, not lighter, exactly, but settled, like the ground beneath her finally felt steady. You ever think about painting it? He asked, not looking up. The cabin. She laid down the last stone and wiped her brow with her sleeve. Wouldn't know what color. I was thinking green. That shade like sage leaves after rain. Harriet crouched, brushing dirt from her skirt. That's a color a person can live with. The next week brought the first calf birth of the season, a red heifer from the neighbor's land wandering too far and dropping her young in the thicket behind their fence. Harriet found them while walking back from the millhouse, her arms full of thread and cloth. She stripped off her shawl without hesitation and wrapped the shivering calf, guiding the bleeding mother with soft clicks of her tongue. When Zachary returned from the smithy, he found her crouched in the straw, the calf already nursing. Neighbor came by, she said before he could speak. Said we could keep the little one, if we could raise him. Zachary crouched beside her, watching the calf's tail flick against the cold. You reckon we can? Harriet rested a hand on the calf's flank. We've made it this far. That night, after the fire burned low, they sat on the floor with their backs against the bed frame, the ledger open between them. Harriet dipped the nib, scratched a careful line across the page. March 22nd, she read aloud. Calf taken in. Mother returned to pasture. Zachary leaned over her shoulder, watching the line dry. You always write like that? So exact. She glanced at him. Only when it matters. He traced the edge of the page with one finger. What would you write about us, then? She didn't answer right away. Then, in a voice quiet but clear, she said, met on the coldest night of the year. Stayed through the thaw. He looked at her then, and whatever came next in the world, it wouldn't change the fact that her words had settled something in him that had never known stillness before. Spring crept in slow, but it came. The field softened. The mule found her pace again. Harriet began teaching 3 afternoons a week in the back room of the feed store, where she kept a slate of her own for the children who couldn't afford their own. Zachary took on more horses at the smithy, and once, even built a gate for a homestead west of town, his hands steady now in ways they hadn't been before. One evening, as they shelled beans by the window, Zachary paused mid-motion. There's a man in town, he said, sells rings. Doesn't ask questions. Harriet didn't look up. You looking to buy one? I am. She kept working, quiet for a moment. Then she said, You'd better take me with you. Can't trust your eye for things like that. They were married beneath the cottonwoods south of town, where the ground was soft enough for planting and the wind carried the scent of sagebrush. The minister spoke plain, and the neighbors gathered with pies and bread wrapped in towels. Harriet wore a dress she'd made herself, soft blue with a clean hem. Zachary wore his best shirt, the one she'd repaired that first winter. After, they walked back to their land together, not saying much. There was no need. The cabin waited for them, warm with the scent of stew on the stove and the faint smoke of the day's fire curling into the rafters. That night, she unpinned her braid and stood at the window, watching the moon rise over the field they'd planted. Zachary came up behind her, wrapped his arms around her waist, and rested his chin on her shoulder. You ever think it'd turn out like this? He asked. No, she said. But I hoped. They stayed like that a long while, the hush of night holding them in place. Years passed. The cabin grew with them an added room when the boy was born, a porch for watching the sky widen at dusk. The garden fed them well. The town grew slowly around them, but never too fast. Harriet kept teaching. Zachary kept hammering. And when the wind turned cold again each autumn, they remembered the night she'd nearly frozen, and the way one blanket and a stranger's voice had changed everything. They were not the kind of people who needed to say things twice. They built their life one quiet moment at a time, each choice shaping the next. And they never left. They had found what held.